Hello, my darlings. Today I'm going to retell you a manga about a policeman who, in his search for justice, became a serial killer himself. Enjoy watching it. The lights in the room were off, and only the glow of frames from a video game on the TV screen illuminated a little space. The game was the simplest one, a classic ring, where you beat your opponent with strokes on a joystick. The player was surrounded by already stale snacks, and by the looks of it, had been hanging out at the gadget for hours and days. After shaking out the contents of the bottle, which didn't look very appetizing, he licked his fingers and then wiped them on his t-shirt. Losing the game, he called the prefix shitty with a condescending look, and then was distracted by the swarm of flies that had taken up residence in his house. But the flies were there for a special reason. They had found a tidbit of lunch and dinner. All around the boy, chopped off pieces of the bodies of small children were lying all over the floor. The limbs and heads of two little girls had been severed from their torso, which the parasites had been feeding on for a long time. Their eyes were open, and there were nasty fly pens rubbing against their whites. The teenager, already tired of the standing stench, decided to clean up his victims in an unusual way. 20 years have passed since those events. A representative of the investigation department named Hiroki Dan was receiving an award, along with other officers recognized as the best for his contribution to solving a case of serial murder of women in southern Kanto. Hiroki Dan was a handsome-looking man. He looked to be in his late 20s to early 30s. Which at that age you wouldn't immediately tell a specific age. He always wore a classic black suit and tie, and had his black hair parted to the side. His features were graceful and harmonious, and his large eyes were blue. Many people thought he literally lived for the job, and had no doubts about his professionalism. He hadn't been on his team very long, so the nickname Rookie was still on his lips when his seniors said that the case wouldn't have unraveled without him, though he managed to rise to the rank of chef. Girls also spread rumors about him, making him their object of admiration. His father is a former police general, and the son himself is friendly and handsome. Everyone in the department, and not only, dreamed of dating him, making him almost their ideal. And there really was a lot of ideal in him. The girls learned that he owned a cottage with a large oven, and perhaps he was fond of pottery. But of course this was only their fantasy, although some noticed that he sometimes brought unsuccessful pottery to work. Another employee asserted that he had flaws, such as bad habits. Hiroki only passed over such conversations indifferently with a cup of coffee. He made his way to the office when he saw colleagues watching a report on television. Hello, there's a special report on LiveDoor today. 20 years have passed since those events. 2 girls, ages 3 and 4, were murdered. The killer dismembered them and sent them to their families. The perpetrator was arrested at the age of 16. He was nicknamed the Butcher Courier. The case infuriated many people all over Japan. At the end of his sentence of 18 years, he was set free. And now, he is writing his book on behalf of the killer, titled Dreams. He plans to announce the book's release, and today we invited him in for an exclusive interview. I know I'm going to be criticized by our viewers, but I assure you, our staff has done everything very carefully and discreetly. Without further ado, allow me to introduce you, Courier the Butcher. The presenter held out his hand toward where a man sat in a chair, hunched over, staring down at the floor. He was wearing a pantsuit, and a bang of hair hid his eyes. The man covered his face with his hands and said with tears in his voice, "I want to ask for forgiveness. To those dead girls, I should have been executed, but the law was merciful and I served my time. I was given a second chance to be a good man. Forgive me." The criminal began to choke back tears. The presenter asked the audience to pay attention to the cries of the penitent. Of course, such a transgression cannot be forgiven. It is a serious sin, but nevertheless. Hiroki Dan stepped away from the TV with his colleague, pondering. First of all, that this murderer has no remorse in his voice, and secondly, why is he releasing a book about his murder as soon as he gets out of prison? The lower eyelid of the investigator's left eye began to twitch nervously with thought. There were talks all over the department about the past report. The detectives couldn't get their minds around the fact that publishers were really willing to pay any money for a book and print it without even thinking about whether it would pay off. One of the seniors in the department replied that he was the one who had investigated the case 20 years earlier. And what he had discovered then. That's not something a man is capable of, but a true monster. In the meantime, 2 men were sitting in a room in a prestigious high-rise hotel. The Butcher Courier, sitting at the table, squeezed the sauce onto a plate of sashimi, and once he had poured out all the contents, proceeded to eat. He took the knife fully in his hand, covering the handle with all his fingers, as one does when attacked, and ate all the slices from the knife. Next to him, with a courteous look, sat a representative of the publisher where the book would eventually be published. The meat courier's name was Sozan Yoshi. He turned to his interlocutor and apologized that he had overplayed his hand on the TV show. At the moment he was sitting with the most jovial and snide look. The murderer began to explain to the man how difficult at first, but then easier to kill and cut up the victim. And then told him that when the bodies began to rot and smell, he had the idea of putting them in gift boxes and sending them to their parents. At this recollection, Yoshi enjoyed and laughed, slumped on his side on the couch. They had a drink, discussed the live broadcast under the cameras, and then the butcher held out his hand to the reporter and said he had only used his hands in the killing. He grabbed the man by the throat and began choking him. When the man's eyes began to roll up, he threw him to the floor, squeezed the sauce onto another piece of fish, and shoved it into the gasping man's mouth, and left the hotel. As time passed, Yoshi was riding on public transportation, covering his face with a medical mask. A woman stood in front of him, holding her young daughter, who was looking at the man from over her mother's shoulder. Their eyes met, and the killer in his thoughts, with an eager gaze, longed to strangle that little neck and hear the cries in agony. Even at the end of his confinement of 18 years, the lust to kill children had not disappeared in him. He came home, but his house was overrun by reporters, and after calling Sensei, he received no instructions on what to do next, so he went into the alley for a smoke. From behind, investigator Hiroki Dan approached him and stunned him with a stun gun. Yoshi woke up in an unfamiliar room, tied to a chair. Next to him was a detective sitting in a second chair, watching Exorcist, a 1973 American horror film on the big screen, the only Oscar-nominated film of the genre based on a story by Hiroki. The detective began to tell the plot of the film while the tethered killer screamed for him to be let out of here immediately. The investigator also began yelling help, showing that the victim could not be reached. They were in a cabin in the middle of nowhere with no people around. The detective continued his monologue. He talked about the fact that an average year about 80,000 people go missing, some of them either alive or dead, or remain missing altogether. And the bottom line is that no one will be looking for Sozen Yoshi. The detective took out a chainsaw, and, with madness in his eyes, began sawing his victim's arm. Not yet completely severed, but after torturing the man, he stepped away from him. Sozen Yoshi, in agony of pain, dissected by his own blood, began begging him for mercy, that he would give his fee for the book. But he was not listened to. The detective sipped a drink from the cup. Maybe it was coffee, maybe it was also someone else's blood. Then stood on the bridge, and with his head thrown back, he opened his mouth. The drink poured out of his mouth, and he began to act out a scene from the movie that was still running on the screen, as if a demon was being kicked out of him. After commenting that it was his favorite scene, he sat down on the floor with a nonchalant look, not understanding why the bound man was looking at him so dumbfounded. Hiroki picked up the chainsaw again and proceeded to the climax. Apparently, Sozen lost consciousness as the detective began to wake him up. When he woke up, he was sitting in front of a mirror. One arm was cut off at the elbow, the other at the shoulder, one leg at the thigh, and the other at the knee. He was in shock and horror. He was completely without limbs, just his body. Then the investigator showed him where his legs and arms had gone. Since it was soon to be Christmas Eve, he made a small potted Christmas tree out of them and decorated them with Christmas decorations and garland. The detective took a Polaroid picture of his victim and whispered in his ear that he didn't do it for revenge for the girls or for money. He did it only to see the desperation in his eyes. He got what he deserved for lying on television. The investigator came out of the burning house. With a contented, cheerful look, he flipped through an album with pictures of his victims in agony and despair, sitting in his comfortable home. Sozen Yoshi's flesh slowly burned away, exposing the remaining skeletal bones, skull, and organs, and then the flames consumed them as well. Some time later, Hiroki visited the pastor at the church. He spoke again of the deed he had done, wishing not to be redeemed, but still to go to heaven to meet his old friend there. He left, promising to do as many deeds as he could. The girl began to wake up. Her body did not move, and her eyes and mind were clouded. She could not remember at all what had happened to her before she fell asleep or how she had gotten here. She was lying in an apartment or a hotel room, and she was surrounded by several guys. They addressed her by her name, Yasuno-chan, and filmed her undressing. There were 4 of them, one filming, the second and the third, who was only in his underwear, undressed her on the couch. The 4th watched, sitting in an armchair. After taking off her underwear, the naked guy cringed when he saw the traces of menstruation on her underwear. This was good for the guys, because now they could rape the girl unprotected for as long as they wanted. She didn't move, but she understood. Though she didn't scream or lash out, she felt incredible pain inside. Tears came to her eyes, and she bit her index finger until it bled. Meanwhile, in the first apartment, the detectives were discussing what had become of the Butcher Courier book, the publication of which had, of course, been cancelled. Chief Dan and his subordinate were drinking coffee and sodas on the roof of the building. He immediately noticed his colleague's troubled look and asked what was eating her. She received a report from a 21-year-old college student. The report began with her going out for drinks at a party with friends hosted by a university student. As often happens at such get-togethers, one of the guys suggested a game in which the loser drinks a glass of wine. They held out the glass to Yasuno-san, and even though she didn't want to drink, she made her. In the end, all the girls were very drunk and had a bad memory of leaving. The detective found out that 3 guys had called a separate cab for the 2 girls, except for Yasuno-san. And when she came to, she was already being raped in an unfamiliar apartment by several guys from the company, taking turns with each other. Waking up the next day, she found herself abandoned in an alley near the train station with no clothes on. It wasn't until a month after the incident that the girl mustered the courage to come forward about the rape. The detective advised her to undergo medical examination at the hospital after the rape and to write a statement to the police, which the student did. STI and pregnancy tests were negative, but there was no evidence of resistance due to alcohol intoxication, which hinders the investigation. There is also no evidence against these guys. Physically, the body has healed, but the girl's soul will never heal, and in addition to her there are plenty of others just as wounded, who will live with these horrifying memories for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the organizer of the party denies his involvement. Detective Mia Ryo tells it with a droopy look and regret that she can do little to help the case. Hiroki Dan's eye began to twitch, and he replied that if he could, he would surely help in some way. Meanwhile, Yasuno Hamada had been invited to the cafe. He was the lawyer of the most important of the company of guys who abused her body. The lawyer's name was Akira Maruyama. He invited the girl to hand her an envelope containing a large sum of money in exchange for her withdrawing her statement from the police. The girl threw the handed envelope on the table and replied that she was not going to take her statement. The man decided to blackmail the poor woman. He said that the past intercourse between her and his employer was not rape because she had consented. She looked at him dumbfounded, denying that she had not consented. He pulled a laptop and headphones out of his briefcase, and then turned on a video clip of her sitting naked and half-conscious on the couch while the guys around her asked her to say cheese on the camera. One of her arms was bent at the elbow and her fingers were depicting a peace gesture. Her eyes were staring into the lens. This could really be put forward in court as consent to sex without resistance. If Yasuno does not take the statement, the lawyer will be forced to send it to the investigator, after which the whole police will see the video. The girl was horrified and fell for the manipulation. After the meeting, she withdrew the statement. Ikwaki Thuru, a student rape mastermind, a 21-year-old boy and son of a wealthy businessman, was out with his boys at an upscale restaurant. Ikwaki was good-looking, had beautiful brown hair and elegant facial features, though he wore glasses, but they did not spoil his appearance. On the contrary, they gave him even more nobility, emphasizing his intelligence. But was he really intelligent and courteous? One of the subordinate guys, Aoyama, went to the ATM and then brought his patron a club membership fee of 53,000 yen. This guy has only been with this company for 6 months, which has completely, in every sense, turned his life upside down. About 6 months ago he went to university, where all first-year students were immediately divided into 2 categories, the cool ones and the losers. He fell into the latter category. This was not new to him, since he had always been a gray mouse in school as well. He did not make friends in the course. Everyone found out that he was a virgin and made fun of him in every way, that sometimes he even had to have lunch in the bathroom stall. Then one day a guy with glasses, an elite guy, came up to him and asked, "Would you like to change?" It was Ikwaki. He was the founder of a club called Mod. The club's activities consisted of turning unsightly young guys into seductive beauties. Many of them became models, idols, stylists, photographers, actors, and voices, excelling in all those areas that are in great demand among the female sex, which was the most important key. Club members dreamed of being popular with girls, and successfully achieved it. The ILO consists of the emperor, Ikwaki, the aristocrats, his closest associates, and the townspeople, the ordinary members. The first installment is 53,000 yen and is paid monthly. The young student gave his last money for a better life and joined the club. 3 months later, there were already 30,000 people in the club. The student became one of Ikwaki's assistants, taking pictures of the party and slipping powders into the girls' drinks. He was forced to videotape the whole abuse process, and when she said those weren't doing the right things, then they offered to be the first to use the girl. He had sex with her, taking his virginity and showing his comrades that he was just like them. Ikwaki approached him after what happened and told him that the Mot's main motto was share a hole with everyone, which meant that every girl they caught was shared among all the men. As time passed, Aoyama became one of the emperor's cronies, changed his haircut and became really cool in the youth's terms. In order to pay for club expenses, studies, and his life, he had to go to a part-time job in a store where he met a cute girl, Akimura-san. He asked her out on a movie date and then walked her home holding hands, which was her first handshake with a guy. Aoyama realized that he had truly fallen in love and didn't want to do the dirty business of the club anymore. He came to Ikawaki with a request to leave the club, paying an exit fee of 13,000 yen. It seemed to him that he was really let go, that there was nothing wrong with leaving the student organization. After all, he had helped out and always paid on time. But they lied. When the guy and his girlfriend were out walking in the evening, a bunch of guys came around the corner and got out of the van, armed with bats. They beat up Aoyama and grabbed poor Akimura, putting her on the floor of the van, where they taped her mouth and began to undress her. Ikwaki reminded his former comrade that they were obligated to share a hole always, and would now get punished for it. Yasuno went to her friend, who worked as a detective and investigated the case that handled her case, and asked for a statement from the police. At the end she said, all in tears, that she never wanted to remember it again. And then she left. On the roof of the building, the two detectives discussed the case again over a cup of coffee and a can of soda. She told about Yasuno's meeting with that lawyer, and that more than once several girls had applied for Ikwaki, but had been taken away afterwards, and apparently they had also been bribed and then blackmailed. This guy gets away with everything. His father owns a corporation and is a pretty famous politician, so he'll go out of his way to cover his son's reputation by hiring a slick lawyer. And he also owns several in an upscale area of Tokyo, where he does all his business, which is where poor Yasuno. Hiroki Dan listened intently to his friend, while his eye twitched again. The girl in the van tried to scream, but because of the taped mouth it was not possible. Tears flowed from her eyes. She was shown a large and long fresh cucumber, which she had to stick in herself, and if she did not do so, a terrible thing would happen to Aoyama. At this time a cigarette butt was already extinguished on his open eye. He wriggled in pain and blood flowed. She obediently took the vegetable and began to insert it into her vagina. All this was filmed on video and accompanied by laughter of the guys, who were very amused that innocent Akimura takes her virginity with a cucumber, then, stained with her natural lubricant, shoved it into her own mouth. They made her lick off her own fluid and then began to rape her. They continued to the apartment, where they played a game of counting how many thrusts each guy would come in, and whoever lasts longer is the winner. The girl was killed inside herself. Her body would still be able to recover, but the moral turmoil would never recover. She would always feel lifeless and devastated. Aoyama was now forced to walk around with an eye patch. The next day he tried to call Yuri, but she did not pick up, and then it turns out that the girl, after her experience, tried to commit suicide by throwing herself from the roof of a high-rise. She actually jumped and crashed to the ground, but she didn't die. She was taken away by ambulance in a critical condition. Aoyama never bothered her again. The lawyer went to his tenant's apartment and began to admire the new video. This middle-aged man had perverted tastes. He liked to watch the process of raping virgins. He stuck to the screen harping on how beautiful the girl was, even though the screen showed an unfortunate rape victim in pain. Ikawaki called his lawyer the ultimate pervert. Aoyama came to them with a new membership fee, having withdrawn his last money for it and crying in desperation at the ATM. Ikwaki was distracted by a text message on his phone and went out to the balcony, seeing from there how the one-eyed guy started chopping everyone sitting in the living room with an axe. He closed the veranda doors and ran, running into a man who was resting outside the apartment next door. It was Hiroki Dan. He knocked the guy out with a stun gun and took him to his torture chamber. The guy woke up with his hands and feet chained to the metal bars of the bed. He was lying on his stomach, naked from the waist down, with a stack of towels under his groin, lifting his pelvis. Dan began to tell him about his favorite movie, The Exorcist, telling him that there was a scene in the movie in which the devil possessed a girl, forcing her to masturbate, causing her to have a cross inserted in her vagina. It was the same kind of cross he brought for Ikawaki as well. It was a very large-sized object, the long base of which was covered with spikes, and the tip itself was triangular and sharp, like a stake they put in vampires' breasts. He inserted the sharp end of the cross into the guy's anus and began to twist on its axis, scratching the guy's insides with the spikes and thrusting it along the base. The branches of the cross served as a rudder for him to scroll around inside. Everything inside was shredded, and blood poured from the pelvic hole. The detective implored that Ikwaki would now cleanse himself of his sin and fornication, rid himself of the filth, and would never again be able to harm innocent girls. Never again. Hiroki took a Polaroid picture of his victim's torment, saying he wanted to see his despair, and then proceeded to twist the cross in it, mimicking the guy's game of push-pull counting. He reached the number 666, even though by then the young man was already dead. All of his abdominal viscera had been cut open, and he had not survived his punishment to the end. The posthumous deeds of the dead boys were publicized throughout the local media, and a mass rape investigation was launched, vetting the entire ILO club. Now the girls could breathe a sigh of relief. Yasuno, Akimura, and all the other victims had been avenged. Despite the heartache, they were able to go on with their lives. Hiroki Dan left the church in high spirits, glad that he could do good deeds. The TV station was broadcasting live breaking news. Inside the Minato Mall, a young man wielding a knife wounded many people. The Metropolitan Police Department detained the 20-year-old man on suspicion of murder. After the terrorist attack occurred and the dangerous criminal was apprehended, people in the stores were still crowded in panic. In the hall of the mall, a little boy was crying because he could not find his mother. A middle-aged man, a reporter for a local magazine, approached him and asked, since his mother was most likely stabbed, what was the boy feeling at the moment. This indelicate way of treating the boy was immediately stopped by Mioraya, the detective who had worked on the previous rape case. She was an industrious young lady, with pretty features and dark hair in a tight ponytail. She got along best with Detective Dan, with whom, after the last case was solved, a very nice and comfortable relationship began. She wore a short-sleeved summer shirt and a brightly colored armband on her forearm that read Metropolitan Police Department, 1st Investigative Division, which police officers wore in emergencies like the current one. Together with her colleague Hiroki Dan, she took the boy under her protection. They brought order, searched the mall for victims, and reassured citizens. But the journalist did not rest there. After all the events, he went to the killer's mother's apartment. He began ringing and banging on the door, but the woman would not let him in. He yelled that the mother of the murderer lived there and that her son had sent 12 people to the other side of the world. To keep the neighbors from hearing, she had to let the journalist inside. He began recording the interview on his tape recorder and immediately asked if she had raised him in violent conditions, which may have contributed to the desire for violence. The woman dropped to her knees and, with her forehead to the floor, choking back tears, began to ask for forgiveness and regret. He lifted her up and demanded to know how she had abused her son. The younger daughter came out and put her arm around her mother. She escorted the journalist out, wanting to create peace for her mother. The man sat with his assistant in the car and reasoned that parents are always to blame for creating murders and should be punished as well as their children. The woman stood at the balcony and kept muttering words of entreaty for forgiveness. She threw herself over the railing and crashed hard against the pavement, unable to bear the stress of the shock of what her child had done. The girl cried, hugging a bag of her mother's ashes, looking at her framed picture. She was still a teenager and all alone. But even in the grief that had not yet fully passed, she was not left alone. While she tried to be alone with her memories of her mother, reporters surrounded her, asking questions, shouting over each other, which ended up creating a noise like a swarm of bees. The same reporter came up to her and also asked her a question. Your brother is in jail and your mother committed suicide. What will you do? There was no answer. At a private high school for girls called Juliet, several schoolgirls were discussing rumors about the sister of the killer who had recently slaughtered several people at the mall. They say that after her mother died, she, too, tried to slit her own wrists, but the attempt failed. No one had much sympathy for her, but they understood her condition, rejoicing that their teenage lives were much better arranged. Arisu Onizuka, one of the gossipy girls, was a bully who got away with everything. After class, along with her classmates, they dragged a young math teacher, Suzuki Takashi, to bully him like he was a schoolboy. They poured water on him with a hose and then began to clean his hair with a mop, saying that he stank, which was probably not true. They started calling him a loser and a stinker, and the fact that he had a wife and child was surprising. They started insulting his personal life, and then tried to get him to take off his pants so they could film him on the teacher's phone camera without his underwear. But the man pushed the student away, which ultimately became a sentence for him. She accused him of physically abusing the student, and since there was no evidence, the truth was behind the girl. They were summoned to the principal's office, where the girl's father, the journalist who had written about the murder in the shopping center and who had driven the woman to suicide with his interview, was already waiting. They expressed their sincere apologies, but he was not satisfied with that. And the journalist asked the school principal to fire the math teacher since the moral damage to his daughter was severe and irreparable. And although there was no proof, the teacher had to be fired, and the girl's father wrote a horrifying article about him that made him unlikely to find a new job at another school. 6 weeks had passed since then. The girl talked on every corner about how she didn't understand the principal at all, how he could keep such an unqualified teacher for so long. But her cool dad is a real fighter for justice and creates real order. She triumphed in and out of the school, bragging to her friends that she could expel such a loser, and anticipating how her father, together with other journalists, would drive the unfortunate man to suicide. And so they did. He slept with his wife in separate beds. She was dozing soundly beside their baby's crib, and Suzuki was lying in his own pool of blood, holding the knife that had slit his throat seconds before, and his sleep would last forever. The journalist was invited to a TV show as the author of the most sensational articles, and the father of a daughter who had been bullied by a teacher. He spoke about how physical and psychological pressure and abuse are equally important and equally punishable in a particularly grave way, and that there is no forgiveness. And it is his job as a journalist to shine a light on such cases. This program was filmed shortly after breaking news reports that the bodies of a woman and a man had been found. As it turned out, before his own suicide, Suzuki had strangled his wife, who was lying on a nearby bed, covered his 1-year-old daughter's head with a plaid to suffocate her, but thanks to fate, she survived, and then stabbed himself. The mother of the murdered man began calling their house, but not getting through and being frightened, immediately called the police, who then discovered the bodies. The first investigation department began to investigate the suicide, looking for motives. Hiroki Dan found a report that included a copy of a weekly journal from a month ago. It described all the events that had occurred at the girls' school. In addition, the report included a suicide note from the teacher, in which he told the whole truth about what happened when he pushed the student. Police found phone camera footage showing Arisu Onizuka bullying her teacher. This video was posted by a classmate and went viral on the internet after everyone knew from the news of the teacher's death. Rumors spread around the school and everyone turned their backs on Arisu, whispering loudly behind her back that she drove Suzuki Takashi to suicide and was therefore his killer. The girl didn't want to go to school anymore. She had not left her bed for a very long time, crying incessantly. Her conscience tormented her. Her father, who did not come to her room very often because he was divorced from her mother, knocked on her door, but he was still her father and her support. So she thought. He walked right up to his daughter, pulled out a tape recorder, and asked her how she felt now, after realizing that she had driven her teacher to suicide, which made her indirectly a murderer. She began to cry, making excuses that she and the girls were just having fun, and she didn't mean to drive the teacher to suicide. The man began to praise himself that he would release a real sensation, because no one but him could interview his daughter, and he would get a lot of money for the article. He didn't care about his child's mental state. He kept asking questions about how the unpunished murderer, which she is, felt. The article was released, and the journalist, sitting in his car, was on the phone with a colleague, talking about how it was the sheer mayhem that the students were driving the teachers so crazy. In between, he mentioned that his daughter had committed suicide because she could not stand the guilt. He didn't give a damn about what had happened in his family, and he didn't have an ounce of sadness about the dead child. He was distracted on the road by another driver, which he stood up abruptly, preventing others from driving safely, when suddenly Detective Dan was in the back seat of his car. He knocked the journalist out with a stun gun and moved into the driver's seat. The reporter woke up in an empty room, tied to the back of a chair. The detective picked up a bottle of liquid and poured some over the man's head. His skin sizzling and bleeding, he began to scream in pain. Hiroki called the liquid holy water, which expels the devil, which he made from a high concentration of hydrochloric acid. He then asked the victim for an interview. An exclusive opportunity to ask a question of an insatiable freak who is beyond the reach of the law. "How are you feeling?" he asked, but the answer didn't come through. And then the detective put the neck of the bottle to the bound man's mouth and made him drink every last drop of the contents, invoking the power of Christ to heal him. The man with the burns on his face could no longer say a word, only the sound of a Polaroid flashing. No one in the magazine missed the journalist in particular, and the school began making excuses to the public about what had happened, promising that now not only the school, but all other institutions would be watching more closely for bullying and violence, not only from teachers to students and between students, but also from students to teachers. This story served as a great lesson for violent teenagers. The parents of the deceased teacher thanked the investigating department and took their granddaughter in. Detective Dan made a funny grimace, making the little girl laugh. Mia Ryo looked after them, hoping that the girl will grow up happy in this cruel world. The detective gave her a clay coaster for sticks, which was rather crooked. After all, his success at pottery was not as good as his work. This afternoon he made himself a delicious lunch, enjoying being able to do a good job again. Hiroki Dan's morning began cheerfully and calmly, as it always did. He took a shower, made himself a delicious breakfast, whipped out a cup of coffee from a mug he had handmade from clay, read a fresh newspaper, and then dressed in his suit and slung his briefcase over his shoulders. He was going out with his bicycle to go to his favorite job. But alas, the flashlight stopped working, so he took the train. Walking to the station, enjoying the nature, he sat in the carriage, packed to the brim with people, as is always the case during rush hour. He stood, holding the handrail, next to the girl who was holding her baby, who was crying inappropriately, disturbing the quiet ride of the other citizens with his loud voice. The office worker, Agata Yudai, was a middle-aged man who was always displeased with everything going on around him. He stood behind the young mother and complained about the baby's crying. What is this woman thinking, walking into a full wagon with a crying baby? He resented. Detective Dan struck up a conversation with the girl, telling her that her baby was very sweet. This further enraged the office clerk, who began to gnash his teeth with indignation, believing that such behavior did not deserve compassion. Agata Yudai came to work where one of the female employees served him a cup of tea, and instead of thanking her, he started flirting with the prettier colleague Miki-chan, saying that he would like her to make him a cup of tea next time, because a pretty girl makes the drink taste better, insulting the employee who had kindly served him the mug. The plump Yamasu left him insulted and Miki in fear and distrust. He was summoned by his superior, reprimanding him that this kind of communication with girls in these times was not proper, unless he wanted to go to the police for moral harassment, and therefore should stop such dangerous jokes, which were very unpleasant to hear. Agata became even more furious that some 2 girls dared to complain about him, that they were real ugly and his boss was arrogant and sassy. After his day at work, he made his way to the train station, shoving all the people he came across, 2 girls talking for just talking, a woman for standing in one place, another girl just for being overweight, and it made his mood improve. He began to smile and enjoy hurting and disturbing other people. There was a girl standing at the station with a stroller in which her small child was sitting. The mother was absent-mindedly looking around and glancing at her phone, trying to figure out which way to go. The terrain was unfamiliar to her. Yudai was infuriated by this, and he decided to get even. He got in the way on purpose, putting his foot in the way, and the girl, without noticing it, accidentally ran the wheel of the stroller over his shoe. He threw a scandal on the whole platform, screaming that how could she not look around? All she did was stare at her phone, and owed him an apology, and behaving so unacceptably. The young mother was very humble and bowed an apology, explaining that she was trying to find her way because she was lost. The man continued to be indignant, which caused passers-by to stop and look at what was going on with an angry look. He got into the carriage, where the girl was again standing with the baby in her arms, who was sitting in a baby carrier. The mere presence of a crying infant again provoked him to get naughty, and as the girl was about to get off at the station, he pressed the lock holding the straps behind her back, causing the carrier to no longer be airtight. Then he shoved her forward, and when she felt the baby begin to fly away from her, she clutched at him, covering her head with her hands, and flew herself onto the platform, hitting her head on the ground and bleeding from her wound. People began helping her up and calling an ambulance, while Agata wished she and her child had been hit by a train. The noxious man was followed by a detective, walking on his heels to a bar. There, Agata met his friends and drinking buddies who also frequent the establishment regularly. They began to discuss a woman's place in society. That 40-year-old single women are useless and waste oxygen. That women's place is in the kitchen and to bring up children. That their desire for equality is nonsense. That only men should earn money. And that the female sex is just a servant and a resource. The girls at the neighboring table looked condemningly at the upstart, commenting that with such a worldview he would live his life as a bachelor in the modern world. Agata decided to go to the bathroom, saying he would be back soon. On his remaining glass of whiskey on the rocks, sipping a martini, Detective Dan looked on with a sly look. After he drank, he went to the subway station to return home. The man felt bad, even though he hadn't had much to drink. He seemed to be drunk out of his mind. He boarded the last train to Takao, and found the girl standing, holding onto the handrail and leaning tiredly. Her light-cut sundress showed her belly, showing she was already a decent age pregnant, and on her bag hung a keychain that read "Mom to be." He cringed, thinking to himself how pathetic she was for thinking someone would give up their seat for her, even though everyone was driving just as tired from work right now. The young girl gave up her seat to the pregnant woman, but no sooner had she sat down than the office clerk immediately took it, his nose up her nose. The people around him looked at him with condemnation and disdain, but he did not care, as long as he did not give up his seat to the more needy. The alcohol put him to sleep, and he fell asleep. The train had long since arrived, and all the people had gotten off, but he continued to sleep. The driver tried to wake him up, but to no avail. Meanwhile, on the top luggage shelf, Detective Dan lay and waited for his moment. When the driver left, he came down, taking the sleeping Yudai under his arms and leading him away from the train. The sun was rising from behind the mountains. The view of the raging river and the green plains with blue skies was amazing. The man awoke to the first rays of sunshine and an invigorating cool breeze. He looked down and saw a chasm and a river below him. He was sitting on the edge of the bridge in a baby carriage seat. Yudai was seized by terror, and he began to scream in panic. His hands and feet were tied and he began to look around until he noticed Detective Dan standing nearby. This is a railroad bridge that was closed about 30 years ago. Later they set up a great place for bungee jumping here. No one comes here now, though, said the investigator, holding up 2 ropes with hooks. The office worker didn't understand what he was doing here and why he had been kidnapped. Hiroku only replied that he loved children very much, as they were the most innocent and pure creatures of this world, and that Ogata had treated these angels badly all day yesterday. The man started screaming and begging and crying to be spared, that he was not a bad person. He was just having a bad day. Dan said they could now see if today was a good day. He attached a rope to the stroller and threw the man into the abyss, shouting to him one last time that he wasn't really wearing insurance, just the seat belts of a simple baby stroller. The man instantly fell from the chair, and after lingering in the air, fell into the river, smashing his head and bones on the rocks. Before he fell, the detective managed to capture a spectacular shot of a face full of horror for his collection. He put on his safety harness and attached a rope, jumping with the rope in a safe manner, enjoying the sunny day and the views of the green mountains. Getting rid of yet another rogue, he felt very easy on his soul. But after enjoying the jump, he realized that since he was on the bridge alone, climbing back up would be extremely problematic, so he had to climb up the rope on his hands. The workday came. Mia Ryo started showing her coworkers pictures of her grown-up nephew, whom she had seen over the weekend, and asked what her coworker had been doing. He replied that he had been bungee jumping, then caught a huge fish, which was actually catching a corpse out of the water, then cooked it, or rather burned the corpse in the big oven that was in his cottage. And there were even some pictures from that wonderful fishing trip. True, after all the physical training, he was quite tired. But it really was a wonderful weekend. Nighttime Japan was lit up by the light of LED signs and huge screens with advertisements. In one of the cafes sat a budding video blogger who was filming a mukbang, a video in which people eat on camera. In front of him on the table was a sea of different plates, including all kinds of sushi. The young man ordered the entire menu, intending to try every dish. He set a goal of eating everything in 10 minutes, but he only managed to eat half of it. The other customers and the restaurant's employees started to stare at him. An elderly receptionist asked him not to order so many dishes next time. The guy started filming him, saying it was improper to say that to the guest because he had paid for everything. After the restaurant, he went home. His pseudonym was Naokin Z Star, and he proudly pronounced it. But in reality, he was in a deep creative crisis. iTubes is a video sharing site. Naokin shoots, edits, and then posts videos for the world to see. Bloggers who post on this site are called iTubers. An iTuber receives money for advertising in videos, and the more views and likes, the higher the sponsors pay, since their product is well promoted. If you become a popular iTuber, your annual income can exceed 100 million yen. Naokin's videos only got a couple of views, 5 or 7 at the most. He didn't hit the recommendations for viewing at all, no matter what genres of blogging he tried his hand at. The guy's real name was Naoki Wei. He lay on his bed, staring up at the ceiling, thinking about why he couldn't become popular. Because there were bloggers that were times worse and more boring than him, but nevertheless they had a large audience. One of the young man's biggest fears was becoming a public servant. He was sick of the gray mass of people with the same kind of education that drove to rush hour every morning to work another day of paperwork just like the last. The salaries of these losers were very low, and 80% of the total population was made up of them. He, on the other hand, thought he was special, individual, chosen, and different from everyone else. He wanted fame, money, and fans. He was walking down the street, dreaming of money falling into his hands from heaven and people shouting after him that he was a star, when suddenly at a crosswalk he was pulled out of his reverie. A traffic accident occurred in which the man ran over several schoolgirls, some of whom died and others were severely injured. Naokin realized this was his finest hour. He pulled out his camera and turned it on, filming the accident that occurred. The children were crying, screaming that they were hurt, calling for their mother. Puddles of blood and pitying sobs were everywhere. It was morally painful to watch this picture. The guy posted the clip on the website, putting a shot of the elderly driver on the cover and the screaming title. The views and growth of subscribers started streaming, and even though the numbers weren't yet big enough, star sickness had already hit the boy's head. He realized what genre suited him and decided to continue shooting provocative and criminal videos. A couple of days later, it became known that 3 children were killed in that accident. They were buried, expressing regret. It was real grief broadcast on the news. But sometimes someone else's joy is built on someone else's grief. The number of subscribers of the novice blogger has exceeded 300,000. And in order not to lose the recruited audience, he was going to shoot a new sensation. He was walking down the street and noticed magazines that interviewed the mothers of dead children, but the answers were few, and then he came up with the idea to sneak to the house of the killer's driver and ask him about what had happened. Thanks to the power of the internet and resourceful subscribers, he found the address. The old man lived in a mansion in a nice neighborhood. Naekin posted a sign with the address and took pictures of the entire area of the house, posting them online. Because of this, many of his subscribers started coming to the hapless driver's house, shouting their opinions, painting the walls, taking selfies in the background, and doing various other hooliganisms. He was thrilled. The number of subscribers grew to 670,000. He decided to shoot the second part outside the home of the perpetrator of the accident. He started filming various graffiti left on the walls by his viewers when a girl dressed as a Lolita came up to him to meet him. After she left, 2 police officers approached him, asking what he was doing. They started demanding his identification, but the young man ignored them, answering only that everyone knew his name because he was the famous Naekin Z star. They banned him from filming, but he continued, which caused him to be taken to the station. As it turned out, because of the effect made by his video, after a mass gathering of people near the cottage, accompanying hooliganism, a patrol was assigned to watch the order in that part of the neighborhood. At this time, Detective Dan and his colleagues descended to the ground floor. He got a picture in front of him of a young guy filming the privates, asking them if he could go home. He left, and the grown men began discussing the younger generation that was so obsessed with video blogging. The detective's eyes began to twitch as he looked after the guy who was leaving, running after the spectacular stories. Late at night, Detective Dan sat in his apartment, in his cozy pajamas and sipping a hot drink from his clay mug with an illustration of a bunny. The panoramic windows of his apartment overlooked a lovely nighttime city filled with skyscrapers and the bright glow of neon lights. He watched a video on YouTube in which 2 cute girls were dancing a love dance, which was a popular trend. After memorizing the motif and movement, he effortlessly learned and danced the entire choreography, not forgetting the charming smile. He decided to record such a video of himself. In spite of his brutal path of fighting for justice, he was a very nice young man that really loved cute dancing, pottery, and cooking. Or maybe he was pretending to himself so he wouldn't notice the devil in him. Naekin posted a video where he got caught by police officers and ended up at the station. His views and popularity kept growing and growing, and his thirst to make an even more exciting story consumed him even more. He was riding on public transportation when suddenly, a man in an unusual lace dress with a puffy skirt and a Lolita-style cap, with blonde curls and bright makeup, started hitting on him. Or rather, he did not. There were no witnesses to it, but the girl began to resent him. Naekin immediately began filming everything on camera. Scared of the camera and people, the man ran out of the car, running away from the lens. He collided with another passerby, who jerked away from him, causing the man, without looking where he was running, to fall under the wheels of the train. Not a trace of him was left, except for his arm, which had flung aside. Only a bloody mess was left on the tracks in the front of the train. People screamed in horror and could not find the girl who had accused the man of molestation, who had, in fact, caused the accident. Naekin posted a new video online, which has racked up several million views, after which he became one of the most popular bloggers of all of YouTube. In fact, the whole incident that happened was his doing. The girl who looked like a porcelain doll was the one he met outside the mansion of the driver who had hit 3 children. After some interaction, she became his mistress. He incited her to accuse that man of molestation, and then to run in pursuit, making sure he got hit by the wheels. The girl lay in his bed naked and shaking with fear. She asked the guy if she was sure she was safe, as he had promised her, to which he replied that she had no proof that he had asked her to pretend to be a victim of molestation and safety he had not promised. He's making money from the viewings and she's only sleeping with a celebrity. They each got their own benefit from the deal, and if she makes accusations against him to the police, no one will believe her without proof. The girl begins to cry as she sits on the floor, at which point a new idea pops into Naekin's head. He wants her to pretend to have a guilty conscience, after which she commits suicide. But before doing so, he informs him personally, after which he films her suicide on camera, broadcasting it live. When Naekin returned home, a package was waiting for him in a small envelope, although he had not ordered anything. Inside was a CD. He inserted it into his laptop and watched it. On the disc was a video of some man in a costume dancing a love dance popular with girls. Full of crap, which he had already intended to turn off, until he noticed that the setting around the dancer was his room, which was where he lived and was right now. From beneath the plaid on the bed peeked out a hidden Detective Dan with a very satisfied look. He stood up to his full height and introduced himself to the young man as Duncan Z Star, after which he knocked the frightened boy out with a stun gun. The young celebrity woke up in an underground parking lot in which it was very dark, with only a half light coming from a large screen. Stamps of various cars were parked everywhere. He was lying on the floor, and around him were several cameras on a tripod that were attached to the very screen that was showing him at the moment. Before he could figure out what was going on, a car started coming at him, and the guy screamed, covering his face with his hands. At the wheel was Detective Dan, driving the car with a cheerful smile. Maniac managed to dodge, escaping from under the wheels at the last moment. The detective turned the handbrake sharply, and while the guy was sitting on the floor before he could think to run away again, the wheel of the car ran over his foot. The tire wheels were covered with spikes, and the young man crouched in pain. The detective got out of the car and watched the screen, which showed a close-up image of a face suffering in terrible agony. The blogger's entire face was in tears. When he was able to catch his breath, Hiroki brought one of the cameras to him and asked him to pay attention to the screen. He looked there and saw his shattered leg, which made him scream even harder. The detective quoted the guy as saying that he needed more clips to keep the viewers happy, and then got back behind the wheel. He ran over his second leg and then both arms. The young man was already dead from pain, shock, and blood loss. His face was still wet with lots of tears and hunched in a grimace of pain. It was a new addition to the collection of Polaroid pictures of the sinners who were ruining this world. The detective revisited the video he had taken and was in a real euphoria. He began to pirouette gracefully, reflecting that despair is the most exciting tune. And Nayakin Z-Old became the prisoner of his own selfishness, which was now smoldering along with his bones in the big furnace of the country cottage. One night a group of 3 guys and 3 girls went on a group date. They didn't know where to go to have fun at all when one of the young men suggested launching fireworks on the riverbank. The girls supported the idea, and the small crowd went to the stores to buy fireworks and food and drinks for the picnic. The girls turned out to be freshmen and the guys turned out to be third years. Kusano Shot was a blonde guy with a fancy haircut wearing a baseball cap and a Hawaiian shirt with palm tree. They were the coolest in the company, and the leader, scavenging money for good clothes and booze. Takashi Obayashi, the quietest, yet funniest of the guys, was a brunette who wore a mallet and glasses because his eyesight was bad. The third was Harala Jackie, who looked the most like a neo-formal. His hair was in a bundle and part of it was shaved at the temples and back of his head. He had an earring in his ear and wore round-rimmed glasses, probably for style. He was quiet and smoked a lot. After sending Takashi and the girls ashore, Kusano and Harada went to a store near a gas station. They began discussing the girls they were able to pick up, only to have further one-night stands. They thought the girls were ugly in the face, and only the large breasts of each of the invitees saved the situation for the guys. Calling their passions milk ducks, which was extremely insulting, they mocked their one-night stand situation. Hearing this, the other customers looked at them with contempt. The salesman began to look at them with suspicion. They were filling a basket, putting many snacks, wine, and various kinds of fireworks in it. Harada was already drunk, and realizing he had drunk too much, was about to vomit the contents of his stomach onto the floor of the store. His friend took a bottle of water from the fridge and handed it to his companion. He drank a few sips and thanked him. He immediately felt better. But at that moment the manager of the shop began to approach them and warned that they would have to pay for the bottle. They started hitting on the man that they weren't thieves, and of course they would pay for the water. It's just that one of them became abruptly ill. They made a fuss and played up a real scandal, putting themselves above the manager, that he was a bad employee, daring to call customers thieves, and made the unfortunate man get down on his knees and ask for forgiveness, or they would file a complaint with the head office of the store chain. The man had no choice, as he did not want to lose his job, and ended up kneeling down and apologizing. The guys were surprised and started filming him on their phones. They rudely threw the basket to the cashier demanding to punch their goods, and threw a bottle of siphoned water at the manager's head, paying for it as well, then left the store. The guys came in with the bags to a friend and girlfriends. They laid out a picnic, taking out snacks and opening cans of alcoholic drinks and soda. Then they started setting off fireworks, lighting them with the long lighters most often used to light fires and gas stoves. The guy in the cap and the guy with the shaved back of his head and temples were sitting off to the side on a long ladder that was placed down the slope by which they were sitting. They drank and smoked, once again making sure the girls had some nice breasts. The ladies themselves and a third mate were having fun and partying by lighting their lights. A homeless man and his dog came up to them, asking them to leave, as there was a sign right next to them that said in plain language that it was forbidden to set off fireworks in that area. Kusano Shota stood up and replied that the words of some homeless man did not tell him what to do, nor did the signs, and that he made his own rules, wherever and however he wanted. The guy with the glasses pulled up, commenting that the man smelled awful, and to keep him away from them. Afterwards, the 2 boys threatened him to get the hell away from them. But afterwards, Shota changed his mind, and ordered the man to apologize with the words that he was eating out of the dumpsters and he was very sorry that he had dared to bother them. Takashi began clapping his hands while coaxing him to apologize by getting down on his knees. The girls really didn't like the behavior of the suitors and left. The guys got really mad at the homeless guy for screwing up their whole attempt at sex and threw a tin can in the back of his head as he left for his little wooden barn where he slept. The company went off to drink at Shota's bar. They returned the next morning, and after making sure that the man and his dog were not in the barn, they broke in. The cottage contained modest belongings, 2 tables and a small plank in the form of a bed. On one table were pots, cans of canned food and a bottle of water, and on the second was a radio and a picture frame that showed a picture of a woman and a little girl smiling and hugging, the little girl waving one hand into the camera. Most likely it was a picture of the man's family, with whom something had happened, since he was now forced to live alone in such conditions. But the students didn't care. They took bats in their hands and began to break everything down. When the barn was destroyed, they found yesterday's lighter in the grass and set everything on fire for the last time. After praising each other and laughing, they fled the scene. The man returned in the evening, and when he saw what had been done to his shelter, he was horrified. But most of all, he was overcome with grief when he saw that the photograph was half burned, and the remains were black and charred. It was his last possession. The boys looked at this picture from a distance and laughed in their voices. They shouted and scoffed that all bums are trash that must rot. They only hinder society with their existence, and should all take a break. Meanwhile, Detective Dan was circling his apartment waiting for the long-awaited package. And so the delivery man rang the doorbell and handed over the box. He unpacked the package, which contained a shiitake mushroom growing kit called Fun Shiitake Mushrooms. He placed the contents in a video cylindrical fungus in a container and sprayed it with water, then covered it with a special dome. Under greenhouse conditions, small mushrooms gradually began to grow. After the class with the new hobby, he went to bed, but ended up staying up watching his mushrooms grow. The unfortunate man went to the police, saying that his tent, which contained valuables, had been burned. Meanwhile, a group of hooligans were partying in a bar, getting drunk and partying. They were still remembering the look on the bum's face, and Takashi even acted out a parody. They went out drunk and walking around found another homeless man's barn tent just like it. It was a common square structure in Japan, housing people who had lost or were unable to buy their own apartment or house. They poured fuel on the tent and threw an ordinary cigarette lighter. The flames immediately burst into flames and engulfed the barn. People walking nearby noticed the fire and immediately called the fire department. The guys ran forward, fearing a fine for arson, but they didn't consider the fact that there might have been a man inside the tent. The homeless man was sound asleep, and when he woke up it was too late. He died and was burned alive. This was reported in a morning news report the next day. This arson was attached to a case complained about by another homeless man and his dog, which implied that someone was engaged in mass arson attacks on the temporary housing of homeless people. While the case was being discussed by their superiors, Hiroki Dan and Mirai went out to lunch. Today, the detective brought with him a bento of homemade food, among which were stuffed shiitake with meat, boiled shiitake, and shiitake with fried rice. A friend wondered why all the dishes were of mushrooms, to which a colleague replied that he had a large harvest. The girl thought he had gone to the woods for mushrooms, which the investigator thought to herself. They heard the news on television, a case that had not yet reached their hands. Mia became indignant about what kind of fiends dare to bully the poor and needy, and why they would even do that. Listening to the news and to her friend, Detective Dan's eye strained. The guys were getting drunk at the bar again. Hisano was getting some young man drunk, flatly refusing to get up from the table until he threw up, when the two friends dragged him out into the fresh air. They showed him the video from the news on the phone and expressed their fear that the police might find them and charge them. The gang leader reassured them that they had no witnesses or evidence. While they were talking in the alley, a Shiba Inu dog, a rare breed of stray dog, most likely belonged to the man, walked up to the trash cans. Hisano kicked it in the stomach, which made it jump and fall to the ground. A homeless man, whose house and belongings they had mercilessly destroyed, was walking toward them. He ran up to his pet, trying to protect it from the hooligans, and then recognized them and realized they were involved. He grabbed the guy in the cap by the shoulder, yelling at him that they had burned his family's precious picture, but the young man shoved him away from him. He fell to the ground. Hisano took a long umbrella from an umbrella stand and began hitting the man with it, followed by a glass bottle with which he hit him in the head. The man lost consciousness. They hit the dog with the umbrella, after which he whimpered and hid behind trash cans, fearing for himself and his owner. They examined the man, bleeding. The whites of his eyes rolled back, and considered that he appeared to be dead. Now they had become murderers directly, though before they had been indirectly, through the fire. But the young men didn't chicken out and immediately realized that they needed to hide the corpse immediately. They wrapped it in burlap and put it in the trunk of Takashi's car. Taking shovels with them, they set out into the woods at night. Despite the threat to their safety and impunity, they still complained in passing about such trifles as the scratch on the hood of the new car and the fact that now they wouldn't get enough sleep since they had to go to the university for their first class tomorrow. As they opened the trunk, an angry growl and barking could be heard behind them. It was the dead man's dog, which had been chasing them all along, wanting revenge for its owner. They struck it with the shovel, causing it to fall backwards and whimper in pain. Finding a deserted place, seldom visited by tourists, they began digging. Suddenly they noticed that the body in the sack began to move, but if they had already started, they had to finish, because if they had let the homeless man go alive, he would have run to write a report on them for attempted murder. They began beating him with shovels, and when he stopped twitching, they were finally convinced that he was now 100% dead. They dug a hole, dumped the corpse in it, then buried it, and started walking back to the car. It was already dawn, and the morning was cool. Thick, milk-like clouds of mist enveloped the land. In another part of the forest, not far away, Detective Dan was mushrooming, picking, for some unknown reason, nothing but mushrooms and toadstools. Suddenly, a Shiba Inu ran out of the bushes to meet him. He noticed that the doggy was wounded, but it was calling with its barking to him. He realized that the animal wanted to show him something, so he followed his four-legged friend. The dog led him to a clearing in which the ground had been dug up, and drops of blood could be seen on the wet soil and grass. Here was the murder and the unsuccessful attempt to hide the body. The boys were very unlucky to have a homicidal detective nearby. The three friends walked through the thick fog trying to find their transportation, swearing and cursing along the way. Eventually they were lost altogether, and the road was not even visible at arm's length. At one point the leader began to turn to his comrades, but when he heard in response the silence he turned around. His friends were gone, and panic gripped him. Where had they gone so suddenly? Behind him was the detective, looking with a sly squint and a satisfied face. These guys made his mushrooming trip that much more interesting. He knocked out the victim and carried him to the others. When they woke up, they found each other tied with ropes in bags similar to the one in which they had buried the hobo. Only their heads were not covered. They were sitting in the hole, and they didn't understand what was going on. The detective was looking down at them, saying he just wanted to go mushroom picking this afternoon, but he hadn't expected such a development. The guys asked him who he was, to which the investigator laughingly replied that he owned the land. Then he left and they started shouting after him where he intended to run off to, but then they heard the rumble and clatter of the tracks of an excavator. The young man, wearing a helmet, got behind the wheel of the machine and began to pour the bucket into the large hole that had been dug, burying the company of three bullies alive. They screamed in terror and panic, but there was nothing they could do. The detective began humming his own rendition of the children's song Wheels by the Bus, substituting words. The wheels of evil spinning, spinning. Eliminate the garbage, eliminate the garbage. He hummed the tune in between. Turning off the machine and taking off his helmet, he picked up the Polaroid he always had with him, like the stun gun, and took a souvenir picture of three heads sticking out of the ground, covered in tears, writhing in panic and with their eyes rolled up. Then their heads were buried in the ground and they couldn't breathe again, asking for forgiveness one last time. The doggy owner was avenged. The detective brought the Shiba Inu into his house and began grilling the mushrooms he had collected on a small grill. He named the doggy Pazuzu-kun and offered him a portion of his lunch, commenting that it smelled very good and fragrant. The dog sniffed at the food served, then grimaced and moved away from the bowl. The investigator sniggered back, saying he'd get more of it. He ate the poisonous fried mushrooms, which made him curl up as if he were convulsing, like a scene from his favorite horror movie, The Exorcist. His body curved in a bridge and the whites of his eyes rolled up, hiding his pupils. The poisoning was indeed severe. Thank you so much for watching. What do you think will happen next? Write in the comments. Don't forget to like this video. Your feedback helps me release videos more often. See you in the next video.